every society has conflict. This is natural for human beings everywhere on the planet. Every family has conflict, every community has conflict. Uh, but what's happening is that when you escalate a conflict by arming one group or another, or by intervening, or by exaggerating, or by failing to mediate to find a solution, or you find people who have an interest in perpetuating that conflict or increasing it for whatever reasons, then you have war and things like that. And in general, the people who are responsible or who are considered to be responsible or accountable are the ones who have power in a society. Or the ones who, if you see two communities that are at loggerheads and there's a third community that is capable of preventing the conflict or interjecting because they are better, and they don't, then you blame the bigger community. In general, for the last, I would say between the 60s and the 2000s, a lot of the conflict in Africa was caused by the Cold War conflict between the communist bloc and the capitalists, the Americans. So these people were fighting proxy wars using Africans. You know, they would arm one African state against another. There was a lot of attempts by the communists to supply, to get help from Africans, to get resources by supplying weapons to help one side or another. So a lot of the conflict in the past in Africa was created by intervention by corporations or by governments in the West who are interested in escalating a conflict to take advantage of it or to support one armed side against another. So this is the role they played, and this was really brutal. The worst example, of course, the worst instance was the Rwandan genocide in 1994, where the Belgian army was supplying machetes to Rwandan genociders. I don't know that Rwanda doesn't have a machete factory, and yet they had these machetes. They gave them training. Africa doesn't make Kalashnikov guns. We don't make helicopters that were used in the wars in the Congo. So these things were there. They were there, and that was a problem. But I think ever since the African Union was formed and it's getting stronger and stronger, there are rules now. I mean, for instance, when the war in Darfur was taking place about 5-10 years ago, NATO tried to interject itself in this conflict, and people refused. So that was a big concern that we still, increasingly, it's getting harder for outsiders to engage in this kind of activity, right? And the reason being that the United Nations, the international community, NGOs are much more aware of how civil wars are managed and how civil wars are funded. And now there's a big attempt to expose or shame people who are involved in kind of supplying guns or instigating wars, okay? So that's a thing there now. So I think that increasingly, as Africans get better control or understand better how to manage themselves politically, that it's going to be harder and harder for Europeans and corporations that are greedy corporations to fund wars. One of the problems we've had with European countries and North America is that every African state and every political party and every community has its own channels of complaining and trying to get aid from abroad to help them. One group will say, we're fighting in the Congo. Pakistan has a lot of guns. You call a Pakistani person and say, can we have guns? There's no consultation with any other African, and they supply the weapons. Then you go use them to kill other Africans. And the reason this is happening is because we're not having a common voice in the international community. That anybody can go into international market and buy weapons at any time they want if they have the money. And sometimes the weapons are even free. So one of the things that Africans have to do is to ensure that we have a common foreign policy. And you cannot have a common foreign policy if you have multiple embassies, so that every African state, every one of 55 African states, has an embassy in every one of the 190 states. It's a mistake. So what needs to happen is that the African Union needs to create a system where the African Union ambassador in any given country is the dean of all the African embassies there. Or even better, that all the African states have one embassy abroad. You know, the African Union can have an embassy in New York, but they can have 55 desks within that embassy where all the African states are represented. So that way that we don't have to have 55 embassies, African embassies in Washington. We just have to have one embassy, and that embassy can mediate all of the financial negotiations that are going through. You can train African diplomats to negotiate for economic deals together. You know, if Senegal wants a factory built, the negotiators can all don't have to be Senegalese. They can be Senegalese on the team, but you could have Ugandans, you could have Kenyans, you could have South Africans, you could have Egyptians, all involved in this, so that everybody knows what Senegal is getting. And then you have one bidding process. You know, if companies want to bid, you know, investors want stuff in Africa, they only have to go to one stop, the African embassy. If you want a visa, you go to one stop, the African embassy. You don't have to have, you know, Sudan has an embassy, Uganda has an embassy, Kenya has an embassy, Congo has an embassy. This is all a mistake. You know, we keep on fragmenting our own leverage. So if we're unified, we have more strength. You can negotiate better, and you can have an investment project that covers many states, instead of every single African state having to negotiate separately in its own manner. And this has happened before, and in contravention of African Union law. The African Union has rules now requiring full disclosure between African states. And this is true for the East African community and the West African ECOWAS, the West African community, and other. We have 5 blocks within the African Union. And there's a regulation that you cannot unilaterally negotiate any deal, say, with the European Union or the American government without notifying the other members of these groups. Unfortunately, some people don't always follow these rules. Like, there was a famous incident where, for instance, the European Union cut a deal with South Africa to supply food to South Africa, vegetables and cereal. And yet, prior to that, South Africa's food was being supplied by Tanzania and by the other states in what they call SADC, the South African Development Corporation body. So what happened was that, you know, the African Union complained, SADC complained to South African government under Thabo Mbeki, and yet they still went ahead and cut a deal to supply electronics to the European Union in exchange for the European Union supplying agricultural products. And within 6 months, the economies of all the 14 SADC countries had dropped because they were mostly agricultural economies. So Lesotho is a country in Southern Africa. I think the economy dropped by 60% within months of South Africa signing a deal, because Lesotho's main market for agricultural products was the Republic of South Africa. And now European Union was supplying subsidized agricultural products to South Africa. And you can imagine how that's destructive to their neighbors. You know, we don't want to continue doing things like this. But people complain about this. People complain about Thabo Mbeki's decision at that time to do this deal in contravention of SADC rules, in contravention of African Union rules, in contravention of common sense. Because if the economies, the 14 economies of the SADC countries collapse, what's going to happen? The people who have been living in Lesotho will now walk across the border to go work in South Africa, where the jobs are on the farms or the factories that are processing the European products or whatever, or the shops. So all of a sudden, South Africans are getting angry because they have migrant workers, and they want to expel them. And then that means there's going to be war on the streets, as you know, migrants are burning, these incidents have happened in South Africa where they say we don't want foreigners, but they're the ones who caused the problem in the first place, you see. You understand? So it's always counterproductive for an African state to have its own diplomatic and international policy separate from other African states. So we need to have common shared facilities at embassies all across the world. And if you have a common embassy, say, of the African Union, then you can afford many things, you see, because it's cheaper to have one embassy than to have 55 embassies. And an embassy can have good services for the people in the country where it's sitting. So an embassy can own a hospital or can have a special arrangement with the hospital. So if an African gets sick, they only have to go to the embassy for referrals. It will make it easier if they have an arrangement with the university so that, you know, they can have better procedures. They can have visa arrangements, negotiate so that Africans can travel better and easier. And they can have better facilities because they only have to have, you know, one building where all the 55 African states share facilities. So I think it's advisable for African states to do that.
Well, let me hear you say mountain, mountain.